Sid Vicious, Sycho Sid, or Sid Justice. Whatever you knew him as, he was a huge guy with a big ego. He didn't just see himself as a top star, he saw plenty of his co-workers as being beneath him. If Sid didn't like someone, he wasn't scared to talk about it, and some of them he absolutely hated working with. In 1991, WCW's locker room was split between the big men who dominated the main event scene and the smaller wrestlers trying to make a name for themselves. Brian Pillman was one of those smaller guys, and he was desperate to get to the top of the business despite being under 6 foot tall. Pillman was known for running his mouth backstage, and he enjoyed getting in the faces of the bigger guys in the locker room to prove that he wasn't scared of them. Sid, on the other hand, had the old school mentality that the bigger guys should be the top stars, and he didn't think that Pillman had any business being a major player in WCW, and he definitely didn't take him seriously as a tough guy. There was tension between the men backstage, and that boiled over during the War Games match in 1991. So we were in Phoenix at the War Games. Pillman was running his mouth backstage, so I drove him as hard as I could through the cage and as hard as I could through the mat and sent him to the hospital. If Brian Pillman really wanted to be a tough guy, when I beat him up that time in War Games legitimately and then sent him through that cage, he had all the reason to fight me right there and right then, but he didn't want to fight. Pillman's head and neck weren't protected during this powerbomb, and instead of landing flat on his back, he was nearly spiked on the top of his head. The impact left him with a separated shoulder and a severe concussion. Medical staff had to attend to him immediately, and he was taken to the hospital for further evaluation. Sid thought that he'd taught Pillman a lesson and shut him up for good, but he was wrong. Fast forward to October 1991, and Sid had jumped to the WWF. By coincidence, both WCW and the WWF had events in Atlanta on back-to-back nights, leaving wrestlers from both companies staying at the same hotel. Pillman and Sid came face to face once again in the hotel bar, and tensions escalated quickly. Before things could turn physical, Sid left the bar, and for a moment it seemed like that was going to be the end of it. But a few moments later, Sid came back, holding a squeegee of all things. Instead of squaring up to fight with his fists, Sid brandished the squeegee as a weapon, trying to intimidate Pillman. The sight of a near 7 foot monster holding a squeegee didn't exactly have the intended effect. Mike Graham quickly stepped in and grabbed the window cleaning tool and diffused the situation, but the incident became legendary in the wrestling business. In a locker room full of tough guys, Sid was now the guy who brought a mop to a fight. But the next confrontation that Sid got himself into featured a far more dangerous weapon. By 1993, he'd returned to WCW, and he wanted to be the top guy in the company. But there was just one problem. Ric Flair was in the way. It was during a tour of the UK in October 1993, and Sid once again found himself in a hotel bar with a bunch of the other wrestlers. He was loudly complaining to anyone that would listen about Ric Flair's influence, how much he was being paid, and how the company still revolved around the Nature Boy. Arn Anderson was there too, and he took offence to what Sid was saying about his best friend. Beer was thrown and insults were exchanged, but the other guys broke it up before it could turn physical, and Sid stormed off to his room. But the fight wasn't over. Sid grabbed a broken chair leg and pounded on Arn's hotel room door, taunting him to come out and settle things face to face. When Arn answered the door, he wasn't empty-handed either. He was holding a pair of scissors. The two men lunged at each other, and things quickly turned bloody. Arn got the first few jabs in, stabbing Sid multiple times with the scissors. But Sid wrestled the weapon away from Arn and stabbed him repeatedly in return. By the time the other wrestlers came and broke it up, Arn had been stabbed over 20 times and the hallway was covered in blood. Vader was the one who finally pulled Sid off of Arn and kept them separated while the emergency services were called. In the years after, Sid was always deeply regretful that things managed to get so violent between them. A lot of people didn't realise about this whole thing with Arn, and I said it before, Arn was one of the people who really helped me out in my career. He's the one that first helped me out with my interviews, which is a big part of my persona, my character. It was just an unfortunate chain of events that led into that horrible night. Of course, Arn has gone on the record and has always had great things to say about me. I've always had great things to say about him. I've said it 1,000 times. I just wish it never happened. And if it had to happen, I wish it hadn't been with him. It was just a horrible accident. No, not an accident. It was just a horrible, horrible deal. It seemed that Sid never had much belief in Bret Hart as the WWF's top guy, while the Federation had spent years building Bret up as the company's top star. Sid just didn't buy into it. In Sid's mind, guys like Bret and Diesel were the reason that the WWF struggled so badly financially in the mid-90s. These guys were positioned as the faces of the company, and yet business had never been worse. He's arrogant, but this is the thing. When Bret was on top, they couldn't sell out a high school, and people didn't get paid in there sometimes for months at a time, and that's when he was on top and Diesel was on top. The business could have never been that bad, and probably never was that bad before. And on a personal level, Sid found working with the Hitman to be frustrating too. Bret was meticulous about laying his matches out beforehand, while Sid preferred to keep things simple. As a matter of fact, Vince did an interview recently about Bret Hart and he called him a pain in the ass. I do remember when we were trying to get things lined up for a match or something like that, it would always be at the last minute when Bret would come in, and it was just like every little thing that he had to tinker with, and sometimes just, breathe. Throughout the 90s, Sid was a true journeyman in wrestling, and not only did he dominate in WCW and the WWF, but he also showed up in ECW. While Sid didn't have an issue with most of the locker room, there was one person that he didn't care for, and that was Bubba Ray Dudley. There was Bubba Dudley, and there was Devon. Devon was a really super nice guy. Bubba, a little bit of a prima donna. I hate saying that, but I don't know if it was, maybe he was jealous of me coming in. I don't know. Maybe that's just his personality. But while Sid only had to work with Bubba for a few months, the tension between him and Ric Flair went on for years. When Sid joined the Four Horsemen in 1990, he never felt like he truly fit in. He was a completely different type of wrestler from the other horsemen, and Flair didn't agree with him being added to the team. According to Sid, Flair and Barry Windham would come up with spots for all the other guys during their tag team matches, but they'd leave him out deliberately. Many years later, WWE released a DVD documentary about the Four Horsemen, and in an interview, Flair said that Sid's inclusion in the team was an embarrassment. But the real frustration came at Halloween Havoc in 1990, where Sid was told for months before that he was going to beat Sting and become WCW champion. According to Sid, that all changed at the last minute, and Sting ended up retaining the title. Sid believed that it was Flair who was responsible for convincing management that he wasn't ready for the title. At that time in WCW, Flair had the influence to decide who was ready for the main event, and if he didn't like someone, then they weren't going to win that world title. But when Sid jumped to the WWF, he walked into a company where things were set up very differently. The original plan for WrestleMania 8 was Flair vs Hogan for the WWF Championship. It was a dream match that some fans had been waiting years to see, but before long, Vince McMahon had changed his mind, scrapping Flair vs Hogan and putting Sid in the main event instead. While the official reason for the change was that Hogan vs Flair didn't perform well at house shows, it also positioned Sid as a much bigger deal than Flair at the time. To Sid, Flair had spent years blocking his success on his home turf in WCW, but in Vince McMahon's eyes, he was the bigger deal. Okay, let's just say this. Who really is the bigger embarrassment in this business? And that's all I'll say. Is it someone who, like me, who's only had really only one thing over my head that was really not my fault? Or him who's had a cast of stupid things he's done in his whole life? In this business, since I've been in, I've outdone Ric Flair 100 to 1 in drawing money, and that's what the name of the game is. I was main event 90% of my career, maybe more than that, so it sounds to me like someone's feelings were hurt. Another person that Sid never respected was Vince Russo. He didn't just think that Russo was bad at his job, he thought that he was the worst booker in wrestling history. As far as Sid could see, Russo had no idea what made wrestling work, no grasp on how to book a top star, and no clue how to run a wrestling company. By the time Sid returned to WCW in 1999, the company was already in decline, and as far as he was concerned, Vince Russo was the final nail in the coffin. While Russo did make Sid the world champion at the start of 2000, the title was already meaningless thanks to his terrible booking. I just thought Vince Russo wasn't the genius everybody put him out to be, and he did such a poor job, or a different type of job, that I thought, we all thought, it was sabotage. No one could be this bad consistently. If you were there, you would have had to swear to yourself, I swore to myself, that this was sabotage. That nobody could have been that stupid, that dumb. I mean, I still believe it was sabotage. So he didn't just think that Russo was incompetent, he believed that his decisions were so bad that they had to be deliberate. Surely Vince McMahon had sent him to WCW to destroy the business from the inside. Nothing summed it up more than Russo's obsession with pushing Jeff Jarrett. I don't really know the real reason for it, other than we know that Jeff Jarrett was Russo's best buddy, or whatever you want to call it. I think that's another indication, another telltale sign about Vince Russo really not being very business oriented, because that was a bad decision. You don't make decisions like that. Sid never saw Jarrett as a real main eventer. In fact, he saw him as a mid-carder at best, a guy with a guitar and a catchphrase, not someone who should be anywhere near the world title. And Sid hated that Double J was just handed those main event spots through backstage politics as he saw it. And during those few months in 2000, Sid was constantly being positioned as Jarrett's rival, but the fans weren't buying it. No matter how many times Russo put the world title on him, he never felt like a top guy. Sid had zero respect for Jarrett. To him, Double J was a politician rather than a real star, and no amount of booking could ever change that.